Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Andrew Latham and Hannah Tierney about their recent collaborative work on manipulation arguments against compatibilism. They offer a novel response to those arguments by drawing from the work of P.F. Strawson.
Thanks for listening. All right, well, I'm happy to introduce two guests on the podcast today, Andrew Latham and Hannah Tierney. Andrew is postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Philosophy and History of Ideas at Aarhus University, and he works on philosophy of mind and metaphysics, especially free will. Hannah is assistant professor in the philosophy department at the University of California, Davis, and she works mainly on free will, moral responsibility, and personal identity. Andrew and Hannah have recently published two co-authored papers on the subject of today's episode, and we're excited to have both of them on the podcast to talk about their collaborative work. So welcome to the show, Andrew and Hannah. Could you each start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thanks for having us, Taylor and Matt. So my name is Hannah Tierney, and I work, as Taylor said, in ethics and metaphysics, and I'm particularly interested in metaphysical concepts that feature really prominently in our moral lives. So things like personal identity, free will, and more recently, time and temporal passage. I got interested in free will and moral responsibility pretty early on in graduate school, thanks in large part to a number of faculty who were doing really interesting work in these areas. So people like Sean Nichols, Michael McKenna, Jeanette Ishmael, Carolina Sartorio, I think many of which have been guests on this podcast. But yeah, they were all asking really interesting questions about free will, and they were doing it from really different perspectives and using different approaches. So empirical approaches, but also from the perspective of metaphysics and ethics and philosophy of physics. And so it was really salient to me early on, like how relevant questions about free will are into all these areas of philosophy, and then how much you can stand to gain about the nature of free will by taking on these different perspectives.
Nice.
Cool, yeah.
And thank you again for having us as well.
Yeah.
So, as was said earlier, I work mainly in philosophy of mind and metaphysics, especially free will. And I'm especially interested in what empirical discoveries in the psychological and brain sciences reveal about the nature of free will, moral responsibility, and some of the more recently space and time. Free will is a special topic to me, as it's primarily what took me from working in experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience to actually working in philosophy for my PhD. While working in the sciences, and I know there's a podcast about this as well, I was exposed to the experimental work of Benjamin Libet and others, whose results were said to cause issues for our freedom and responsibility. But at the time when I was in the sciences, I was fairly certain that wasn't quite right, or was a bit too quick in how it was being done. But at the time, I lacked any kind of actual training or conceptual resources to be able to, precisely explain why. And so here I am now working in philosophy on free will-related issues.
Nice. Cool.
In your collaborative work, you two have responded to manipulation arguments against compatibilism by drawing on a Strawsonian approach to freedom and responsibility. In earlier seasons of the podcast, we've talked about manipulation arguments. We've talked about a variety of compatibilist accounts of free will. And there's been at least one reference to P.F. Strawson, but we've never really explained what a Strawsonian approach is. So could we start by saying a bit about what makes a view Strawsonian?
Yeah, I'll take this question. So it's kind of an interesting question, like what does it take for a view to be considered Strawsonian? Mm-hmm. Maybe in the broadest sense, we can take Strawsonian approaches to freedom and responsibility to be any view that builds upon or draws inspiration from P.F. Strawson's work in these areas, maybe particularly his paper, Freedom and Resentment. But of course, philosophers have taken very different lessons from his work in these areas and built on his views in really different ways. So the class of views that can be called Strawsonian is quite diverse. In our work, though, we focus on three elements of Strawson's approach to freedom and responsibility that it'll be helpful to highlight now. The first is a conceptual point about the nature of moral responsibility. So in theorizing about responsibility, Strawson emphasizes the importance of thinking about our relationships with one another and the emotions that we experience and the practices that we engage in to praise and blame and hold others morally responsible. And in fact, many have read Strawson as arguing for the view that to be the appropriate target of these responsibility practices constitutes being morally responsible, such that there's nothing over and above there's nothing more to being morally responsible for a particular action than being held responsible for that action when it's appropriate to do so.
Yeah.
The second Strawsonian thesis that we take on is a claim about the relationship between the truth of determinism and moral responsibility. So Strawson has a compatibilist account of this relationship, according to which the truth of determinism is largely irrelevant to moral responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And he defends this view by examining what matters and what does not matter when it comes to our responsibility practices. So according to Strawson, when we examine our responsibility practices, we see that they are sensitive to a wide range of facts about our intentions and our beliefs and our capacities. So when someone unintentionally bumps into us on the street, we don't blame them for doing so because their action doesn't seem to reveal a kind of malice or disrespect of us. They didn't have the right kind of intention to be held responsible for such an action. And the same can be said for agents who unknowingly perform morally wrong actions or do so out of ignorance, and those who don't have the kinds of capacities that we take to be necessary to have the kinds of relationships that make our responsibility practices appropriate. So agents who don't have the right kinds of intentions or knowledge or cognitive capacities, they're not going to be the appropriate targets of our responsibility practices. And because being the target of these practices constitutes being responsible, these agents also aren't going to be responsible. But so can we say the same thing about determinism? If determinism is true, does this render agents no longer the appropriate target of these responsibility practices? Well, Strawson says no, because the truth of determinism doesn't impact anything about agents that matters when it comes to the responsibility practices. If determinism is true, it doesn't make it impossible for us to intentionally perform actions or possess knowledge that's relevant to our actions or have the kinds of capacities that are required to be in the relationships that make these practices appropriate. Mm-hmm. So the truth of determinism doesn't change anything that matters when it comes to our responsibility practices. And again, because these responsibility practices are set the facts about who's responsible or not, determinism is also relevant to moral responsibility as well. The third Strawsonian claim that we focus on is a psychological claim about the indispensability of these praising and blaming practices and the relationships that ground them. So according to Strawson, if we were to accept that determinism is true and that it's incompatible with moral responsibility, this would require a really radical revision of our relationships with other agents. We'd have to take what Strawson calls the objective attitude towards others. We could no longer praise or blame or experience a wide range of emotions that Strawson thinks are really integral to being in the kinds of interpersonal relationships that we find so important. It would destroy those relationships. And for Strawson, this is just a practical and maybe even moral impossibility. We're so thoroughly committed to these kinds of interpersonal relationships that we can't even really take seriously the idea of getting rid of them or revising them significantly, even if determinism turns out to be true.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks. That was awesome.
Yeah.
I think Matt already noted this, but we've talked in some detail in an earlier episode about manipulation arguments against compatibilism. For listeners who are interested, you can check out our interview with Dirk Pereboom from the first season of our podcast. But I think it'd be helpful to have the general ideas kind of fresh in our minds. Would you guys mind talking through the general schema of manipulation arguments against compatibilism?
Yeah, sure. Compatibilist accounts of moral responsibility face a wide range of manipulation arguments. But one way of spelling out the general schema of the arguments is something as follows. First, you start with the manipulation premise. So manipulated agents are not morally responsible. And I'll give some examples of this shortly. But of course, philosophers come up with all sorts of awesome examples involving aliens and nefarious neuroscientists and goddesses. And it's so awesome. Then you add a no difference premise. And essentially, the no difference premise is where this is where all the work is done. And the thought here is something like, look, determinism is relatively similar to the manipulation that's been described in the manipulation premise. And then from these two premises, you get the anti-compatibilist conclusion. And so determinism is incompatible with moral responsibility. Let me illustrate, though, with the general schema with the manipulation argument we focus on in our work, Dirk Pereboom's four-case manipulation argument. And here is a laughably simplified version, but it will be useful for our purposes. Mm-hmm. So, case one, Plum decides to kill White because he is causally determined by neuroscientists, of course, by way of radio-like technology. Case two, Plum decides to kill White because he is causally determined by the way neuroscientists programmed him at the beginning of his life. Case three, Plum decides to kill White because he is causally determined by the training practices of his community. And then finally, case 4, Plum decides to kill White because he is causally determined by the past facts and the laws of nature, that is, determinism. The key is that Peerboom argues that Plum in case 4 is relevantly similar to Plum in cases 1 through 3. And so if we think that Plum is not morally responsible for his decision to kill White in case 1 through 3, then we should also think that Plum is not morally responsible in case 4. We can plug Peerboom's 4-case argument back into that general schema that I described earlier. So first, you have the manipulation premise. Plum in cases 1 through 3 is not morally responsible for his decision to kill White because of the way in which he's being manipulated. Then you add the no difference premise. Plum in case 4 is not morally responsible for his decision to kill White because the determinism featured in case 4 is relevantly similar to the manipulations featured in cases 1 through 3. And from that, you get the anti-compatibilist conclusion. Compatibilism is false. Agents in deterministic worlds are not morally responsible for their decisions because they are relevantly similar to Plum in case 4. We could also, briefly give another example. So Millet's zygote argument, for instance. Millet starts with a manipulation premise. Imagine a powerful goddess, Diana, who intentionally creates a zygote in a deterministic world to ensure that it will develop into an agent who will perform a particular action in 30 years' time. He then goes on to add a no difference premise. He argues that there is no relevant difference between the way this agent zygote is produced and how ordinary human zygotes come to be in a deterministic world. And then from these premises, he draws out the anti-compatibilist conclusion that determinism is incompatible with moral responsibility. In our work, we focus on Peerboom's 4-case argument, but we think that our work generalizes to any manipulation argument, which follows this general manipulation argument schema. That being said, still some might wonder why we do focus in that case on Peerboom's 4-case argument. And the reason for that is because Peerboom explicitly thinks that his argument also challenges Strawsonian approaches as well. Recall for Strawson, as Hannah said, being the appropriate target of responsibility practices constitutes being morally responsible itself. And because determinism is irrelevant to these practices, so too is it irrelevant for moral responsibility. Peerboom thinks, though, that the 4-case argument shows that determinism is relevant to these practices. Cases 1 through 3 straightforwardly show that our practices are responsive to facts about manipulation. However, he rightly points out that our practices are also sensitive to considerations of arbitrariness. If Plum in case 4 is relevantly similar to Plum in cases 1 through 3, and if there are no relevant differences between the cases, then it seems our responsibility practices themselves dictate that we should excuse Plum in case 4. And if Peerboom is right about this, then it turns out determinism is relevant to responsibility practices, and so challenges Strawsonian approaches as well.
Yeah, very cool.
Nice.
In the literature, compatibilists have typically responded in 2 ways. One option sometimes is called the hardline response, and that's to deny this first premise, bite the bullet, so to speak, and admit that manipulated agents are free and responsible. Another option has sometimes been called the softline response, and it's to deny the second no difference premise. And that usually requires pointing out some relevant difference between manipulation and determinism. These various proposals for relevant differences have been given, but yours is distinctive in that it appeals to the Strawsonian framework. So can you explain what you take to be the relevant difference between manipulation and determinism?
Great. Yeah, thanks. The first move that we make is to argue that the Strawsonian can argue that there is, in fact, a relevant difference between the manipulation that's featured in cases 1 through 3 and then the determinism as it's featured in case 4. And then we go on to argue that there's no way to make these things relevantly similar that will allow the incompatibilists to secure their conclusion. So the first move is to identify this relevant difference. And we do this by introducing a distinction between universal and existential phenomena. So determinism is a universal phenomenon. Its scope includes every feature of the universe. An existential phenomenon, in contrast, is one whose scope includes at least one, but not all things within a universe. So in cases 1 through 3, Plum is the target of existential manipulation. He is the only agent impacted by manipulation in these cases. In contrast, Plum is not the only agent impacted by determinism in case 4. determinism, as it's presented in case 4, is a universal phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Its scope includes every agent within a universe as well as everything in the universe. So why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because existential and universal phenomenon operate in very different ways, and they impact our practices in different ways. So in cases 1 through 3, if we come to judge that Plum, because he was the target of this existential manipulation, is not the fitting target of our responsibility practices, then our practices themselves are not threatened. We can go on praising and blaming and holding other people responsible in our universe, just not Plum, because he's exempt from those practices. But this isn't what would happen in case 4. So in case 4, if we learn that universal determinism is true and that Plum's decisions, like every other agent in the universe, are causally determined by facts about the past in conjunction with the laws of nature, and then we also come to judge that Plum is not the fitting target of our moral responsibility practices because his decisions were so determined, then we would also have to make the same judgment for every other agent in our universe. This would require the destruction of our praising and blaming practices. We would no longer be able to hold people morally responsible or praise them or blame them. And that would destroy the relationships that these practices are scaffolded around. And this is precisely what Strawson argues is psychologically impossible to do when he's making his indispensability argument. So in cases 1 through 3, manipulation rules out moral responsibility by functioning as an exemption within a set of practices. The reactive attitudes, our interpersonal relationships, our responsibility practices, all of these things can go untouched if we take existential manipulation to exempt Plum. But in case 4, if determinism rules out moral responsibility, it does so not via functioning as an exemption within a set of practices, but rather by requiring those practices themselves to be destroyed or at the very least significantly altered. And this is a significant and morally relevant difference between cases 1 through 3 and case 4. A Strawsonian can totally accept the kinds of exemptions that cases 1 through 3 point to, but they would not want to accept the kinds of exemptions that case 4 would point to. In fact, a Strawson thinks that such an exemption is impossible to accept.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So if the problem with manipulation arguments is that the manipulation cases that they refer to is about they're about single agents being manipulated, whereas in ordinary deterministic worlds, everyone's determined, then as y'all point out in your paper, we can try to resurrect the challenge, the manipulation argument against compatibilism by modifying the argument such that both the manipulation case and determinism are universal, so everyone's affected by them, or modify both such that only one person is manipulated, but also only one person is determined, and then you could try to build the argument around that. Could you all talk through these different modifications and explain why you think that the modified manipulation argument would not undermine compatibilism?
Yeah, cool. So let's start by considering what happens when we make all the cases universal. Pyramid could replace the instances of existential manipulation in cases 1 through 3 with universal manipulation cases. Mm-hmm. So in case 1, we would ask to imagine a team of neuroscientists who can manipulate everyone's neural states, including Plum's, at any time of radio-like technology. In case 2, we would be asked to imagine that everyone, including Plum, is programmed by a team of neuroscientists at the beginning of their lives. And finally, in case 3, we'd be asked to imagine that everyone, including Plum, is subject to community training practices. Before going on, though, recall the kind of 2 main premises of the general manipulation argument schema. The manipulation premise that manipulated agents are not morally responsible, and the no difference premise that determinism is relevantly similar to manipulation. If we make it so that cases 1 through 3 feature universal manipulation, then they are arguably like case 4, and so Pyramid could defend the no difference premise. Mm-hmm. But these modifications seem to put the manipulation premise in serious trouble. It is simply not clear, or at least to me, that these universal cases elicit the intuition that Plum is not morally responsible for this decision to kill White because of the way in which he's being manipulated. Further, the Strawsonian in this case can just reject the manipulation premise. After all, if it turns out that Plum is not morally responsible in these cases because of the way he's being manipulated, then no one is. But this would mean that our responsibility practices would be eliminated, or at the very least would need to be drastically revised, which the Strawsonian thinks is psychologically impossible to do. It is worth noting that some of our most recent experimental research supports our contention here. We've tested people's intuitions to both existential and universal formulations of the cases found in Peereboom's four-case argument, and found that ordinary people's free will and moral responsibility judgments are sensitive to the scope of manipulation. People straightforwardly judge someone to be free and responsible when everyone is subject to universal manipulation, whether by, we used aliens instead of neuroscientists because they're cooler, or community training practices, but not when someone is being existentially manipulated. The other way Peereboom could modify the argument is to make all the cases existential. Peereboom could modify the determinism in case 4 to be existential rather than universal. That is, we would be asked to imagine that Plum is a perfectly ordinary human being, except for the fact that he's unique in being causally determined by the past facts and laws of nature. With this modification, once again, cases 1 through 3 are arguably similar to case 4. And in granting the manipulation premise, it seems like Plum is not morally responsible in the existential formulation of case 4. And that seems right. If Plum really is different from everyone in virtue of his decisions being determined, then perhaps there is some sense in which Plum has less control over his actions and decisions than other people. Further, it seems possible that our responsibility practices might be sensitive to such a difference. If we come to know that a single individual in our universe is subject to determinism while every other agent is not, then this might affect our reactions to this individual. It is important to note, though, that accepting that does not mean accepting the ordinary anti-compatibilist conclusion that universal determinism is incompatible with moral responsibility. That would only be correct if the other agents in the case are relevantly similar to Plum. But in the existential formulation of case 4, other agents are not relevantly similar to Plum. It's Plum and only Plum who is determined by the past facts and laws of nature. The Strawsonian in this case can grant that people who are existentially determined are not responsible, without also committing themselves to the claim that if everyone is determined, then everyone suffers that same fate. Further, as noted earlier, they have a principled reason to reject such an implication. Our responsibility practices can be responsive to existential factors, just not universal factors, on pain of elimination. I guess in short, you can summarize in the fact that existential premises, existential cases 1 through 4, can only support an existential conclusion. They can't support a universal conclusion, of which the original kind of anti-compatibilist conclusion is a species of.
Yeah. Maybe could I ask one follow-up question about that? I'm curious.
Got one too, so you go first and I'll go after that.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So in the existential version, could the Peereboom, incompatibilist alter their conclusion such that they don't see themselves as arguing for incompatibilism, but just showing that there are certain flaws in compatibilist proposals? So, I guess I was imagining you could make it so that even in the existential version of the of the whole argument, Plum meets various compatibilist conditions on freedom and responsibility, say I don't know, John Martin Fisher and Mark Revisa's reasons responsive account, and yet, despite satisfying those conditions, isn't morally responsible, apparently. Would it at least call into question the sort of viability of those compatibilist proposals? Or do you think not?
So I guess what we say about that is that this might indicate that the compatibilists should revise their view, but that it's not going to be a threat that they can't overcome. So when we argue that existential determinism really might function as a kind of exemption, that does put some pressure on the Strawsonian view, which was that determinism is irrelevant to moral responsibility. Mm-hmm. And so when we're saying that determinism, at least in its existential form, could be relevant, that might require some revision for the compatibilists. But that's not unheard of. I think some people think that determinism is relevant to our moral responsibility practices, and it can even affect them without eliminating those practices or without making it impossible to be morally responsible. Mm-hmm. And so our way of kind of expanding on the Strawsonian view is to say, here's something that's relevant to our practices, the kinds of capacities that we have, the kinds of intentions that we have, the kind of knowledge that we have. But there's these other circumstantial facts that are also relevant to these practices and to the relationships that we have with one another. And if someone is unique amongst everyone else in the universe, because they're the only person in that universe who's been manipulated or determined, that really might alter our relationships with them and affect whether we hold them morally responsible. But that doesn't mean that that same kind of force, when it's in a universal form, will have the same effect. But if everybody is determined, or if everybody's manipulated in the same way, that doesn't affect our relationships in the same way. And we can have the same kinds of relationships that we typically have with them and continue to hold them morally responsible, praise and blame, and so forth. So I think the kind of upshot from existential determinism indicates that compatibilism might need to be revised, but is not a fatal blow to the view.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You have to supplement it with some Strawsonian framework to avoid that kind of problem. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have something on that, Andrew? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it sounds right to me. There's something interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking on kind of our empirical results, at least with respect to determinism, because that's a particularly interesting kind of case. And for example, in the first kind of paper, the first kind of set of research that we did, we just looked at the kind of determinism case relative to kind of the upbringing case. And the key takeaway from that original finding was that there was virtually no effect of manipulation. That is, people treated the kind of determinism cases much the same as the community upbringing cases. And that the only thing that seemed to matter for people's kind of free will and moral responsibility judgments was the scope of the manipulation. That is, whether the determinism is existential or universal, and whether the upbringing is existential or universal. And so, one way of kind of reading that is that, look, in some sense, people are treating kind of factors all relatively the same, but what people are really paying attention to with respect to kind of causal factors on their decisions and actions is the kind of the scope of the causal factor, whether this particular factor affects everyone's decisions and actions, or whether it affects only my decisions and actions. And certain kinds of factors that affect only my decisions factors may be excusing kinds of factors. That's probably not the place to bring it up, but we find something slightly different in our most recent study, which I've only just finished analyzing. And in that case, we went for the kind of more difficult cases, I guess you could say, the more kind of the real kind of test of the existential universal thesis, which is, well, what happens when we kind of really draw out the kind of aliens actually kind of implanting devices in heads and causing everyone's actions, or aliens programming coming zygotes from birth. Like, surely everyone in those cases, I mean, Van den Wagen used that as a famous case against Tony Flew in the kind of paradigm case argument. Yeah. Surely no one would accept, everyone like that would be free and responsible. And we find, people do. They think if everyone is like that, then so be it. That's perfectly fine. But if you're existentially like that, then no, that they're completely off the ball of that. Yeah. But something interesting happens in the determinism case in the second time around we ran it, which is that we didn't find the same degree of scope, existential universal difference for determinism the second time round. And there are two ways of kind of reading into that. One is that actually people are just distinguishing determinism as, they're not doing what they did in the first experiment, which is that, look, here's a whole bunch of kind of factors which might kind of impact your actions and decisions. What matters is the scope. In this case, it seems like they're distinguishing between, look, here are a bunch of factors which can affect everyone, or everyone, or just one person. And these things are the things that show the existential universal effect. So that's the aliens kind of programming you from birth, or the aliens kind of implanting your heads. And then there's determinism, which, we didn't find the same kind of scope difference the second time round, which suggests that maybe if that's right, then maybe people aren't treating determinism like the other kinds of factors. That is, it's not being treated like a manipulation. So this is just a call for that more research to be done on this particular thing. That is, if it is treated like every other factor, then it should be subject to the same kind of existential universal scope. But if it's not, if it doesn't show sensitivity to the same existential universal scope, then determinism does seem relevantly different, and is not going to be the kind of thing that a practice is picking up on. And that's what this kind of second letter results show. So it could go either way at this point, and I need to do follow-up studies on this. Yeah. But it seems like either way, the compatibilist is going to be kind of safe. It just depends on which the kind of relevant story is, at least according to the ordinary concept, what's going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your experimental results are based on running these cases with the four case argument, right? Have you done experiments on the zygote argument? So you've got Diana setting up Ernie and, determining his life, however much of the life that you tell in the story. And then you've got another one to get the universal one where Diana sets up everybody in the same way. I guess my question is there a relevant difference between the original design argument, like style argument from Mealy zygote case and the 4-case argument where you're going progressively from one case to the next.
Yeah, so in the Arquetnes paper, we wrote up the results for the study where we really were just looking at, in fact, just like case 3 from the 4-case argument compared to case 4. But then in this most recent study, which we haven't written up yet, but we definitely will very soon, we tried to run a much wider range of manipulation cases. So aliens, did we do goddess, Adam?
Yes, we did. But we did, but we replaced Diana is now an alien. Just so we didn't, because I mean, there is something that might be said, like you could imagine maybe people do respond differently, say to goddesses or gods and goddesses, kind of, determining actions versus kind of aliens. But to keep it all consistent, we did a manipulation with an intentional outcome, which is probably the closest to the kind of Mealy zygote argument. And also looks like kind of case 2 and kind of Perrigum's kind of 4-case argument. And so we ran that one as well. And we also reran the determinism case as well, being the kind of the court case that needs to be kind of replicated each time around. I mean, so basically we ran each people. We didn't. So to go back to the original question, we didn't run it kind of like how the 4-case argument is kind of run. So the kind of 4-case argument kind of runs almost kind of like scaffolding your judgments as you kind of go. Like, let's start with a case where we all agree. Look, if I can manipulate your kind of decisions at any time by pushing this kind of button, then move to the next case where, of course, well, I program you from birth. I don't intercede after that point, but I kind of fix the initial conditions such that if determinism is present, then you will undoubtedly lose action in the future. And in the community practice and so on. So people only see one of the cases. Now, there's something interesting to be said, like what would happen maybe if you kind of can people's ordinary judgment kind of scaffolded into kind of accepting, rather than kind of being presented point blank. If you do just run this kind of series of arguments in the way that the kind of argument gets run in kind of philosophy, can you elicit, would this impact people's judgments kind of going forward? Unclear. I mean, there's an interesting case in which you might think you can, in which case you might be able to then present someone a follow-up judgment, which is like, hang on a sec, notice that you said blah, 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 but notice that things might be actually like this. What do you say now? Are you more committed to kind of following through to this kind of conclusion that this argument seems to have taken you to? Or do you think the conclusion is kind of obviously false and so there must be a kind of mistake somewhere? Can you pinpoint where it is? I don't necessarily think people could come to see or view this as being kind of the relevant difference. Even if they, for example, do feel committed that there is, in fact, a difference between case 1 through 3 and case 4. They kind of do the classic kind of thing, philosopher, like there must be an answer. I can't quite see it, but there's something went wrong there. I can't quite pinpoint exactly where it took place. But that's definitely something to kind of do in the future, which is like, look, we found these particular kinds of judgments. We found this existential universal effect where people are kind of being given these kind of cases one at a time. But if you did actually present them in the kind of way, would you see the kind of existential universal effect carry through case 1 through 3, and then see people's judgments switch exactly as predicted? And then you could imagine doing a kind of variation of the study where you give people the judgments and then vary whether they see an existential universal case and see if you can kind of literally take direct control of their judgments according to which kind of case you present. All cool stuff to do in the future. But that'll be the key test. Like, can you actually show that can you bring people's judgments under the control of this particular factor? Haven't done that yet, but definitely something to do in the future.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I guess one other question I had is, so I find the experimental results very interesting as a sort of, peek into what people who haven't thought as long or as hard as some of us have about these issues for many years, what their initial thoughts about the cases are before they're like, they're motivated by a theory to have certain responses to the cases, like I suspect that I am,
or corrupted
or corrupted. Yeah, I was going to be nice to myself, but yeah, I guess for someone like me who has thought about them for a while, and I think maybe maybe this is a worry about Strawsonianism in general, but once I see that people are inclined to say that in an existential case the manipulated agent isn't responsible, and then I switch to a case where they are treated exactly the same way by the alien or goddess or nefarious neuroscientist, but so is everyone else, I think, why should that make a difference as to whether that initial agent is responsible or not? And yet it seems like the Strawsonian view says, oh, now all of a sudden, even though he's a sort of intrinsic duplicate, or she's an intrinsic duplicate, now they're, on the hook for lots of stuff that they weren't before. So again, I think maybe this is a more general worry for Strawsonianism, but do y'all have any initial thoughts about sort of toggling between the existential and universal cases like that?
Yeah, I guess I kind of think that these context features, or the context in which we find ourselves, do matter when it comes to how we relate with one another, and if that affects how we praise and blame and what kind of emotions we experience when we're relating to that person, that those seem very relevant to whether this person is the appropriate target of our responsibility practices, and maybe in a real sense whether they're actually responsible or not. And this is something that maybe goes beyond the Strawson, but is definitely like a key insight from Strawson, which is like, look at how our practices operate and look at the kinds of relationships that ground those practices. Strawson only focuses on the kind of quality of will stuff, right? He thinks that's what's relevant to these relationships and these practices. Mm-hmm. But of course, like, there are other things that are super important to these relationships. And if someone is just totally unlike everyone else in their community because they've been the target of this kind of manipulation, they're sort of uniquely affected in this way. They're uniquely causally determined. That does seem like it would affect, and it's appropriate that it affects our relationships with them and how we appraise and blame. So I don't see these things as like irrelevant, or as like it's a trick that we're playing when we switch out existential and universal scope. I think that these things, the scope matters when it comes to our relationships. And I think it could definitely indicate that it could really matter when it comes to moral responsibility as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, there is one really gnarly question, which I still don't have the complete response to, but it's an interesting question nonetheless, which is one thing you do find, and actually there's two things actually. Actually, I don't know if I'm digging myself a hole here, but one thing you do find sometimes is that even though, and I think this is true of a lot of kind of experts, maybe this is more general worry, is that you still find, even though people's judgments are affected by various kinds of factors, you still nonetheless find a erring from many ordinary people to just praise and blame in general. So one, for example, thing that we found in our results is even though people's judgments in the initial study was in fact impacted by the existential universal factor, by and large, people, irrespective of it, overall people tended to think that you're free or think that you're responsible, even in, for example, a deterministic world or in a community upbringing case. I mean, one of the reasons why we thought that in the initial case was just that, hang on a sec, maybe there's just something sufficiently ordinary about kind of, maybe not determinism, but at least kind of upbringing, such that, look, it doesn't matter if you have a kind of slightly kind of less than ordinary kind of upbringing, it still is something that everyone is kind of subject to when they're being brought up. And so, yes, your esoteric kind of upbringing might slightly kind of be slightly excusing. It's not going to fully excuse you with respect to kind of free will, non-responsibility judgments. And one thing to say is that in the most recent research, when we look at the kind of alien cases, it's only in those kinds of cases that we do see the kind of full swing, where people actually in those kind of cases, when you're existentially kind of being manipulated by aliens, whether by radio-like technology or the way in which you're kind of being brought about into this world, that you see people's kind of judgments think to say, no, you're not free and you're not responsible. So, yeah, so there is a gnarly. In the original study, we do find, hang on a sec, yes, people's judgments are impacted by this factor, but they still tend to think that you're free and responsible in both kinds of cases, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, that's weird. Well, thanks, Hannah and Andrew. Thanks to both of you for joining us and talking about your collaborative work on the show. For listeners who are interested in following what you're working on next, where can they go to follow your work?
Yeah, so if you're interested in any of the work being discussed here, you can look me up on Phil Papers and Phil People, Andrew James Latham, and there you'll find copies of all the work. Also, you'll find links to various kinds of links to the open science framework, where basically all the methodology, all the hypotheses, and all the data are stored. So you can download a copy for yourself and have a look at the results and have a play with the data to see if there's anything we've missed in that particular data set as well. And yeah, I think that's... Also, yeah, if you have any other future ideas about things to test or variations to test, or please get in touch. I'm more than happy to kind of discuss different methodologies, a way of getting and testing this effect and testing how robust it actually is. I've got high hopes for it, but I'm really willing to put it under some really glorious tests to make sure that actually holds. So
Right.
Please get in touch.
If you want to find any of my work, including the work that we just discussed today, you can go to my website, hannahtierney.com. I'm also on Phil Papers and Phil People.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks so much for being here with us. This was great.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was awesome. It was fun.
No, thank you very much for having us.
Yeah.
In the next episode, we talk with Gabriel DeMarco about manipulation and real-life cases of neurointerventions that affect agents' behavior.